By 1777, the British had a plan they believed would end the American Revolution in a single campaign season. 3 armies would converge on Albany, New York, one marching south from Canada under General John Burgoyne, one marching north from New York City, and one pushing east from Lake Ontario through the Mohawk Valley. If all 3 met, New England would be cut off entirely from the rest of the rebellious colonies, isolated and starved into submission region by region. Burgoyne's force, roughly 7,000 British regulars, German auxiliaries, loyalists, and Native American allies, marched out of Canada in June 1777, and the campaign started almost perfectly. By early July, Burgoyne had captured Fort Ticonderoga with minimal resistance, a fortress the Americans had spent years fortifying. The news thrilled King George III so much that he reportedly burst into his wife's chambers waving the report, declaring he had beaten the Americans. But nearly everything after Ticonderoga went wrong. In August, Burgoyne sent a detachment of 800 men under Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Baum to forage for horses and supplies near Bennington, Vermont. Colonel John Stark and 1,500 militiamen crushed them, costing Burgoyne nearly 1,000 men he couldn't afford to lose. Around the same time, the Western Column, advancing through the Mohawk Valley, was turned back at the Battle of Oriskany, and the Eastern Army that was supposed to march north from New York City never came at all. Its commander, General William Howe, decided to capture Philadelphia instead, leaving Burgoyne completely alone, deep in hostile territory, with supply lines stretched to breaking point behind him. By September, Burgoyne's army had shrunk to around 7,000 combat-ready men. Facing him, dug into fortified positions on a bluff called Bemis Heights, was an American force of roughly 9,000 men under General Horatio Gates, a position so strong that American artillery, 22 cannons, could cover both the river and the only road Burgoyne could use to advance. The first battle came on September 19th at a clearing called Freeman's Farm. Burgoyne split his 7,000 men into 3 columns, hoping to probe and outflank the American position. The fighting was brutal, and the field changed hands multiple times throughout the day. By nightfall, the British technically held the ground, but at a staggering cost. Nearly 600 men killed, wounded, or captured, roughly twice the American losses of just over 300. It was, by any honest measure, a Pyrrhic victory. For nearly 3 weeks, both sides regrouped. American ranks swelled as militia poured in from the surrounding countryside, drawn by the sense that this British army, exhausted and cut off, was finally beatable. By early October, Gates commanded closer to 15,000 men. Burgoyne, receiving no reinforcements and running desperately low on supplies, made a final gamble. On October 7th, at the Battle of Bemis Heights, Burgoyne attacked again. This time, the result was decisive. American forces, including a reckless and technically unauthorized charge led by General Benedict Arnold, who at this point in history was still one of America's most talented battlefield commanders rather than its most infamous traitor, broke through the British lines entirely. Arnold took a bullet to the same leg he'd already injured earlier in the war, an injury that never fully healed. British casualties this time numbered around 1,100 killed, wounded, or captured. Burgoyne's shattered army retreated, found itself completely surrounded, and on October 17, 1777, surrendered nearly 6,000 men in a field near Saratoga. The consequences reached far beyond New York. News of Burgoyne's surrender was the single piece of evidence France needed to justify openly backing the American rebellion. France had already been quietly supplying weapons and money, but publicly allying with a rebellion that looked likely to lose was a risk no one in Versailles was willing to take. Saratoga was the proof of concept. Within months, France signed a formal treaty of alliance, providing money, weapons, trained engineers, and eventually a navy, the same navy that would trap Cornwallis at Yorktown 4 years later and end the war for good. Spain would follow France into the war shortly after. Historians remain in broad agreement. Without Saratoga, there is no realistic path to Yorktown, and without Yorktown, there is no clean American victory in 1783. But every one of those outcomes rested on a battle that could have gone the other way. If Burgoyne had pressed his advantage at Freeman's Farm instead of pulling back to regroup, if the reinforcements from New York City had actually arrived, if Arnold's charge at Bemis Heights had failed instead of succeeding, or if Arnold himself had been killed rather than wounded. So let's ask the question directly. What if Burgoyne had won at Saratoga? If Burgoyne breaks the American line at Bemis Heights instead of being broken by it, the road to Albany opens. His remaining 6,000 to 7,000 men, battered but intact, link up with whatever forces Howe can spare from Philadelphia, and the original British strategy, cutting New England off from the rest of the colonies along the Hudson River corridor, suddenly becomes achievable again. The first and most consequential casualty wouldn't be American soldiers, it would be French willingness to enter the war at all. Without a clear, decisive American victory to point to, the French crown has no political cover to justify an open alliance. The quiet supply of weapons and money likely continues because it costs France little and keeps Britain occupied. But the formal treaty, the navy, the trained engineers, none of that materializes on the same timeline, if it materializes at all. Some historians argue France simply waits and watches for another year or more before committing, if the war even lasts that long in a form worth committing to. Without French artillery and trained military engineers, the Continental Army fights the following winters with even less than the famously threadbare supplies it had at Valley Forge in our actual history. Without French loans and eventually French warships, there is no naval blockade capability to trap a British army against a coastline like Cornwallis was trapped at Yorktown in 1781. The entire mechanism that ended the war in an American victory simply doesn't exist in this timeline. Burgoyne's original objective was never really about winning one battle in the New York countryside. It was about severing New England from the rest of the colonies entirely. With Albany secured and the Hudson River corridor under British control, that plan is back on the table in a way it never was again in actual history after October 1777. This doesn't mean instant British victory. The Revolution was fought as much by scattered local militias as by Washington's main army, and cutting off one region doesn't erase years of accumulated resistance overnight. But it does mean New England spends an extended period isolated, unable to easily move troops, supplies, or coordinated communications south to reinforce Washington's forces in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Massachusetts, Connecticut, and the rest of the region become an island within their own rebellion, fighting a defensive war with steadily eroding resources and no clear path to reconnect with the broader war effort. The Continental Congress in 1777 was already operating on borrowed money and borrowed credibility, printing currency that was rapidly losing value and struggling to keep Washington's main army fed and equipped, even with the morale boost of Saratoga in our actual timeline. Remove that victory, add a British army with New England effectively cut off, and Congress faces a funding and legitimacy crisis at the worst moment. Some historians point out individual colonies had a track record of prioritizing their own survival over unified national strategy when things got desperate enough, and a prolonged crisis without French support could plausibly fracture the unified rebellion into separate regional negotiations with Britain,
each colony seeking whatever terms it could get, rather than continuing to gamble on a war that increasingly looks unwinnable without outside help. Others argue Washington's core army, hardened by 2 years of setbacks already, had a demonstrated ability to survive worse single defeats than this and simply regroup. The realistic middle ground is a war that drags on for several additional years beyond 1781, fought with dramatically fewer resources, and quite possibly ending not in a clean Treaty of Paris granting full independence, but in a fractured, prolonged negotiation stretched across a decade or more, with the borders and freedoms of the country we know today looking nothing like the map on a modern classroom wall. So what does America actually look like if Burgoyne wins at Saratoga? The most likely outcome isn't a clean British victory that ends the revolution outright.
It's a war that grinds on for years longer than it did in our history, fought without French money, French ships, or French legitimacy, the three things that turned a scrappy colonial rebellion into a war Britain could no longer afford to keep fighting. New England spends years isolated and under pressure. The Continental Congress operates on collapsing credit and even lower morale than it already had in the darkest months of the actual war. And the eventual outcome, if American independence happens at all in this timeline, likely looks less like the unified 13 colonies signing one treaty in 1783, and more like a fragmented, prolonged negotiation stretched across a decade or more, with the borders and freedoms of the country we know today looking nothing like the map on a modern classroom wall. Saratoga wasn't just a battle that the Americans happened to win. It was the single moment that convinced the rest of the world this rebellion was worth betting on. Lose that moment, and the war doesn't just get harder, it becomes a fundamentally different conflict with a fundamentally uncertain ending. Let me know what you think would have happened next. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe, because next week we're asking what happens if the French Navy never arrives at Yorktown at all.